Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks very much, Pete, for that introduction. I'd also like to thank my mom and my brother Glenn, who are back there in the middle, for coming out. Glenn would normally be at work contributing to the Valley's GDP, but he's here this morning, so thanks very much. You know, it was great to see that film. I was asking Tom when it was put together, and he said, oh, you know, just in the last several weeks. And I said, can you imagine 5 years ago putting that film together? And, you know, we kind of thought about that. I think the last time I was here, maybe about 3 years ago, and we were just pretty much still in the grip, I think, of a pretty severe period for all of us here in the region and nationally. We were just probably coming out of, although maybe we weren't even sure whether we were coming out of what turns out to be the most severe economic contraction in the United States since the Great Depression in the 30s. So it was really great to see that film. One of the little clips that flashed by reminded me of my childhood. It was the old mill in Lanterman's Falls in Mill Creek Park, and I grew up just a few blocks away from there. So it was kind of brought back some old memories to see that. So thanks for the film. So as I said, this is a great feeling of optimism in the room compared with 3 years ago, and I don't want to mean to drag everybody through the pain, but just to remember where we've been so that I can talk about where we are and where we're going. You know, this great recession that we went through, we lost nearly 9 million jobs in the United States. Industrial production declined by a little more than 20%, and the entire financial system nearly collapsed. So it was a pretty severe period for us. And I'd like to talk this morning about a bit about where we've been, where we are, and where we're headed. And just to remind you of my usual Fed disclaimer, my remarks today are my own. They're not necessarily the opinions of anybody else in the Federal Reserve System. So I get that out of the way. All right. So here's a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'll give you the bottom line, so if you miss some of the nuances in the slides, this is really what I'm trying to tell you. National economy, slow growth, low inflation. And I'll elaborate on each of these as I go along. Labor markets, still a lot of slack remains in labor markets. Households, still deleveraging from pretty significantly high debt burdens. Housing, better, but the levels of activity in the housing sector are still low, so there's a lot of room for improvement in more home building and more home sales. Monetary policy, which I deal with a lot, I'd say has been very effective, and we're in this mode of kind of assessing the benefits and risks of the policy that we have in place, and I'll talk about that a bit later as well. And finally, I want to say a few words about the regional economy before I close. And I think the good news here is keeping pace with the rest of the nation, which normally, after a severe downturn, Northeast Ohio tends to be struggling to get back on its feet. And I think the great news is that we're sort of holding our own here. So I'll talk about that as well. Okay, so let me start by talking a bit about production and labor markets. And this picture that I've got here shows gross domestic product for the United States. That's the dollar value after adjusting for inflation of all the goods and services that we produce. And you can see this economic expansion moving along. This red line is kind of a trend rate of growth line that if we had not had this severe recession, we would have expected to stay pretty close to this trend line. But as you can see, we had a very significant downturn. And after the downturn sort of moderated and growth picked up again, you can see the rate of growth, it's kind of flat. So it's growing along the same rate as that trend line, but below the trend line. And so the challenge is to get back to trend. And normally, after recessions, it takes a year or two, but the rate of growth starts picking up, and eventually we close back up to the trend line. In fact, we usually accelerate past the trend line for a while and then grow back to the trend line. So the real $64 trillion question in some sense is what's holding us back from getting to the trend line. And you can see I've put a little projection in there. So the Federal Open Market Committee, which is the monetary policy making body of the Federal Reserve, periodically produces a set of economic projections, and they have a kind of a range for the projections. And what I've given you is the projection line, and the dashed lines are a little bit of the central tendency around the average projection. So to translate this into numerical terms, for me, what I'm looking at for this year is around 2.5% to 3% growth, real terms for the U.S. economy. And then that's for this year. And then that rate picking up a bit to 3% the year after that, and maybe 3% or a bit higher the year after that. So I do expect to see some acceleration. But I can tell you that at those growth rates, it's still going to take a while for us to get back to that trend line. You could see it in a different fashion by looking at industrial production, capacity utilization, and production. So on the top part of this, we have in blue the capacity of the United States to produce, manufacturing, mining, all sorts of industrial production. And that brown line is the actual production rate. So the difference between the brown line and the blue line would be the shortfall, or the green line, that is the capacity utilization rate. And so three things are evident to me when I look at this chart. One is, of course, the severe contraction in industrial production that I mentioned at the outset, declined by nearly 20%. You can also see, if you look closely at that blue line actually starts sloping down after the contraction in industrial production. What that means is that we actually started taking capacity out, which is very unusual. We usually don't add to capacity during recessions, but this downturn was so severe that we actually had, on net, closings of capacity-producing establishments in the United States in a pretty significant magnitude. So that when the industrial production finally did pick up, as you see the brown line eventually doing, we're actually able to close. Capacity utilization rates actually went up by a lot more than they typically would because of the amount of capacity that was taken out. And we're actually not so far away from sort of long-run trend averages in capacity utilization rates in the United States. I wish the same were true in the labor market, but the labor market has not healed nearly to the extent that the capacity side, the physical capacity side of the economy has. So I mentioned at the outset we lost nearly 9 million jobs, and you can see that in 2008 and 2009. That's when the brunt of all of that occurred. And since then, we've picked up 5.3 million jobs, but that leaves us about 3.5 million short just to get back to the level of employment that we had 5 years ago, let alone to accommodate new entrants to the labor force who would also be looking for employment. And that's the reason we have an unemployment rate that's just a tad below 8% in the United States. We're not there yet where we need to be. And to show you in another fashion how large the shortfall is, I've constructed this slide. So the way to look at this is payroll employment in the U.S. And if you look at the orange line, this is the typical experience over a business cycle. We start at the peak of a business cycle. We lose about 2% of employment in about a year's time. After about 24 months, we get back to the zero line. That means we're back to the level of employment we had before that recession began. And from there on out, we're expanding employment. And those little blue dashed lines around there show kind of a range of average variation for business cycles. The 2001 business cycle shown in blue there, that was called the jobless recovery, if you remember that. That was one where we were really disappointed about how slow things were going. Well, take a look at where we are now. I mean, we've trumped that quite severely. We haven't even gotten back yet to the level of employment. That's that 3.5 million shortfall that I mentioned at the outset. So we have plenty of slack in labor markets and plenty of room to grow. And a strong desire to grow to try to absorb the people who are unemployed. In fact, about 40% of the people who are unemployed in the United States these days have been unemployed for 6 months or more. So we have a significant long-term unemployment problem as well. Where do I think we're headed with that? Well, here's my picture of the unemployment rate. You can see we peaked out at about 10%. We've worked our way down, edging it down kind of slowly. Like to get that rate of descent to be steeper, but sadly it's kind of flat. So I'm looking at an unemployment rate of maybe about 7.5% by the end of this year, maybe about 7% by the end of 2014. That's still going to be above the rate of around 5.5 to 6% that you might think of as an unemployment rate that's more or less consistent with what might be thought of as full employment for the U.S. economy. So we still have a ways to go. Now, why have things been so slow? Well, let me talk a bit about households. Consumer spending, the consumer sector in the U.S. is about 2/3 of GDP. So how interested and how able households are to spend is pretty vitally important to the thrust of activity in the U.S. economy. And I want to start with the housing sector because the housing sector was the epicenter of the collapse that led to the recession that sparked the financial crisis. You should also know that housing wealth is one of the most significant forms of wealth in the United States. Stock market wealth is the other, but stock market wealth is very highly concentrated among individuals in the U.S. Housing wealth is much more broadly distributed. And you can see the boom and bust pretty clearly on this chart. There's two different indices of home prices. One of them shows a much sharper rise and contraction. That one tends to be more heavily weighted in housing markets that are on the East Coast and the West Coast than is the blue line measure of housing prices. But either way, you have a pretty significant run-up and then a bust.